Hello and welcome to Nesta Talks To, our conversational event series with today's most interesting thinkers on the big topics related to our missions at Nesta and innovation methods. I'm Andrew Sissons, I'm Deputy Director in the Sustainable Future mission at Nesta, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Corinne and Eric Lonergan. We'll be talking about their new book, Supercharge Me, a guide to doing net zero faster. And there'll be plenty of time to ask questions, as well as the questions I pose to them. Before I turn to our guests, just a quick bit of housekeeping and a quick background to Nesta. So you can join in the conversation via the comments box on YouTube or LinkedIn. Please do get involved. There'll be a large chunk of this session will be dedicated to your questions, and they're down the right-hand side of your screen. Also, closed captions can be accessed via the LinkedIn live stream anytime during the broadcast. And just a quick background to Nesta before we dive in. So Nesta is UK's innovation agency. We launched a new strategy earlier this year with 3 innovation missions. A fairer start is one, focusing on reducing inequality in early years. A healthy life, which is focusing on obesity and loneliness, is another. And the third mission, which is the one that today's conversation is part of, is a sustainable future, focusing on how we decarbonise our homes and support the growth of the low carbon workforce. Now, I'll turn to welcome our speakers, which I'm very excited to have them here today. So Corinne is one of our guests. She started her career at the UN, working on climate change, and she's been advising global businesses and governments on climate and sustainability for more than a decade. She's also a co-founder of the not-for-profit More United. And Eric Lonergan is a policy economist and author with more than 20 years' experience in financial markets. He's co-author with Mark Blythe of the international bestseller Greennomics that was published in 2020. And he's written extensively on innovations in monetary policy, and he frequently contributes to the Financial Times. So Corinne and Eric, welcome. It's great to have you with us today. Hoping Corinne and Eric will join us soon, but I know they ought to be able to hear us. Corinne, Eric, hi. Great to see you.
Hi there. Thanks, Andrew. Thank you very much for having
you with us. So it's really great to have you on with us today, and I'm really excited. There is loads and loads to get stuck into. As I said, your book, which I've held up once or twice, has been one of the best things I've read recently. It's certainly changed the way that I've approached my work, and it's certainly something I would recommend to anybody who's interested in getting to net zero, whether that's part of your job or personal interest. And I've got a few questions, or plenty of questions to work through on the book. But we'll dive into those if that is all right. So I just wonder if you could start, and maybe Corinne, I'll start with you. But it's almost, I'm going to ask the impossible question of trying to summarize what's in your book in sort of one short answer. What are the main building blocks of supercharging? What's it all about? What are the main building blocks, and what needs to happen? What needs to do it? What is this book? What is the sort of message of this book in a short answer as possible?
An impossible question to answer, because we ignored all the good advice about writing good books and crammed loads of different ideas into one book. But if I was going to try, essentially the key messages are: speed is actually critical to this transition, which is not news to anyone who thinks or works in this space. We have to halve emissions globally between 2020 and 2030. And that's essentially a massively accelerated industrial revolution in terms of decommissioning big parts of the economy and rebuilding replacement low carbon versions. So speed is critical. There's a lot to be hopeful about, because the combination of policymakers, business community and finance community have kind of seen that the train's leaving the station. We have to get on board with this transition, otherwise you will sort of become a pariah or not be a respected player in the global economy. So the door's open, but we are missing some key fundamentals about what policies work to accelerate it. And essentially what we come down to, and this is a generalization, and I think this winds some people up, but we have this phrase that human beings change their behavior if an alternative is better, cheaper, or their friends are doing it. Businesses change their behavior if they make more money or it's illegal. And politicians change behavior to get elected or stay in power. And these are gross generalizations. But when we looked at what had really worked to accelerate the decarbonisation of sectors or at a city-state level or a country level, these kind of truths came to the surface. So there's some of the guiding principles about how we think about policies to supercharge, which is essentially to radically accelerate this transition to a low-carbon economy.
Brilliant. And it is, on my reading, a really optimistic book, but it's slightly different kind of optimism to some of the other sort of more techno-optimists. It's not that you're not sort of about technology, but this is really, I guess, a policy book. It's about people and governments and businesses. It's about organizations. Was that something that was really important to you and a kind of gap?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the points we emphasize in the book is we have this three-part schematic of, what are the problems to be solved in getting to net zero. And one is simple maths. So that's where we have the technologies and they are affordable, they're economic, and we just need to make the maths work to channel enough capital to investing and scaling those technologies. So renewable infrastructure and power generation is a good example. We have a second category, which is mini Musks. This is where we need more Elon Musks, so more kind of mad geniuses who are willing to throw billions of capital at solving hard problems. And we do need some of those in aviation fuel or cement. And then finally, we've got herding sheep, which is changing behaviors at scale. And as we kind of analyze the problem, and we drew heavily on the excellent Energy Transition Commission's work on this, looking at the road to net zero by 2050, it becomes clear that roughly 70% of the problem sits in that first category, essentially electrification of a number of different industries and renewable power generation on the grid. And that's really good news, because that theoretically is the easiest problem to solve, particularly in this era of low interest rates we currently inhabit. So it wasn't, stepping back to answer your question, it wasn't an intentional decision. It's just when we analyzed the problem, we realized actually that the tech, yes, there is more tech innovation to be done, but we've got a huge amount to play with. And we should be focusing on making sure we're scaling these technologies that we have as quickly as possible. So I think that's one element. And then the other element is we were intentionally policy focused because, we felt there was an awful lot of good writing on the nature of the problem and how devastating it's going to be if we don't react to it. But there isn't nearly enough going on analysing what policies are really working and also thinking kind of ambitiously on that front. Eric, would you add anything on that?
Yeah, no, only, if you look at the economic literature on productivity growth, actually the biggest problem the world faces is not a lack of new technology, but a failure to diffuse what economists call diffusion, is actually to take up existing technology. So, yeah, in many ways, there's a lot that we take for granted in the book. We take for granted that we've got a problem and that we've got to deal with it really quickly. So we really don't waste any time trying to convince anybody of what we need to do. We take that for granted. And we do pretty much take for granted that we have the technology to do the heavy lifting because we think the evidence is overwhelming to do that. The only thing I'd really just add is that, of all of the books, we've read probably 30 or 40 books on climate and climate-related policy. And I guess, we have a very, very strong sense that not enough effort is done on what to do. In fact, we start the book with a quote from Thomas Schelling, a very interesting Nobel laureate in economics, who contrasted the relative success of NATO with the Kyoto Agreement. And his point is that it's better to have a commitment to actions, to actually, what are you actually going to do, rather than a commitment to targets. And in fact, that's sort of where the kind of launch point for the book is we want a commitment to actions. What are you actually going to do? Now we have a consensus and lots of commitments to emissions targets, but there's very little direct evidence in terms of, what specifically are the actions one's going to be committed to. And we also think optimism comes from clarity of thought, right? So if you take that electrification piece, so this kind of immediately we try to address two things, which is everybody should know exactly what the diagnosis is from a policy standpoint. And the diagnosis is make electricity sustainable and then electrify transport, buildings, manufacturing. And if we do that, we're looking at 70% of our emissions. Right? So that's the task at hand at a practical level. That's the first thing everybody should know. The second thing that everybody should know is that actually creating sustainable electricity, in a way, we're fortunate that we've left this late, because the technology is such that it's really advantageous. The lead time to build solar farms can be built within 18 months to 2 years. Right. Onshore wind, similarly, even offshore wind, the UK is showing you can do it on 4 or 5 year timelines. So we're actually blessed that the electricity, sustainable electricity, the nature of the capital is that it has very short lead times. That's the first area in which we're very fortunate. And the second area we're very fortunate is because most of the cost with renewables is capital cost. Our cost of capital, despite interest rates going up, despite all these concerns about inflation, it is still the case that we have a generationally low cost of capital. The fact the UK government, I just checked before coming in, can borrow at a fixed rate of interest of 2% for a decade. Now, if you look at all of the investment in offshore wind, in onshore wind, and solar, that generates a return materially higher than that. So immediately you get a very, very different picture of climate change. It's clear what the problem is. Make electricity renewable, sustainable, electrify everything. Okay, how long does it take to make electricity sustainable? Frankly, you can do it in 5 years if you really want to. What's the cost? Well, actually, our cost of capital is really low. In fact, it's lower than our return on capital. So from what I've described so far, there is no cost to the consumer or the household or the population.
If anything, they benefit because, the operating costs of these technologies are close to zero, and we would not be having the energy cost of living crisis we're having right now if we had an energy system not dependent on gas, which is highly volatile and tied to the global geopolitical situation.
That is really striking, and it gives a sense of the optimism that sort of courses through the book, and it's great. I'm sure what a lot of our audience will be thinking is, okay, it's about action. What are the actions? Because it sounds almost too good to be true. I wonder if we could just probe some of the different actions that you think we need to take to sort of get to that future. The first is around, I guess, the business and the finance community, because there's a large parts of the book are about what businesses and finance can do and get this. And I wonder, obviously, a lot of people are skeptical about the idea of businesses or finance being sort of climate saviors. I wonder, Corinne, you've obviously worked for most of your career trying to help corporations tackle climate change. What changes have you seen in how corporations approach climate change? And can we really believe that they have our best interests on the climate at heart these days?
Yeah. So I think, it's misplaced to either view them as saviors or sort of cynical, deceivers. I would sort of perceive them as rational agents responding to a combination of market, regulatory, consumer forces. But what has been notable I've been working in this field, close to 15 years now, is it felt like as a sort of sustainability professional in the corporate sector, you weren't really taken that seriously. And then suddenly the last 2-3 years, you're the person the CEO wants to talk to, and it's a board level priority. So that's just an empirical shift I've witnessed, that climate risk, credible decarbonization action is now a CEO board level priority, and listed and now increasingly privately owned companies are moving on it and investing on it, even without near-term returns on that investment, because the kind of license to operate risk and the regulatory risk is just too high. So that's good news, basically, and this is what we talk about when we say that the door is ready to push on. In terms of kind of what else is needed is that, there's a willingness there, but we need to continue to make the incentives both at the corporate level and also the kind of customer level, be it business customers or consumer customers. We need to continue to make those incentives work. And, we're heavily inspired by Victor and Cullenwald, who are two US economists who've done some great work on climate policy. And they really emphasize the importance of a sector by sector view, which sort of sounds a bit noddy and obvious, but it somehow doesn't come out that often in climate policy. Often climate policy is thinking about, a singular global carbon tax or kind of a singular national policy, rather than saying, let's talk about cement. And we overlay that need for a sector view with our kind of rationalist homo economicus view, which you can criticize or not, that we have to make the green option cheaper. That is what's required to drive change at the pace we need. So we need to take a sector view and say, okay, cement, there's some innovations in green cement. There are low carbon options. I actually just saw this morning, there's even some academics at Cambridge have developed the first zero carbon cement. And the question policymakers need to ask is what can we do? What policy levers can we pull to help that make that option cheaper to the consumers or purchasers of cement? Yeah. So that's the kind of problem statement we set for the business community. And that is a combination of regulation, disclosure, which is incredibly powerful, and fiscal and monetary policy levers.
That's really helpful. And it strikes me that this isn't charity. When you talk about corporations and finance, and we'll come to finance just in a sec, this is what you're describing is making this not something that people do because they're nice, but making it the thing you do because it's good business. Is that a fair?
Absolutely, because we're talking about the kind of the vast majority of the global economy reorienting in massively accelerated timelines. The only way that's going to happen is if it's sort of existential. And thankfully it is increasingly existential, because it truly is. People are understanding the realities of climate risk, and policy and consumers and employees and investors, and everyone's moving in the same direction, saying this is just something we have to do together.
That's really good to hear. And I guess it's that point you make about, the, in a sense, chief sustainability officers having the kind of, board agendas being dominated by this issue for once. And I guess that's not, again, people sort of worrying about things personally. It's a business decision, which is really good. I wonder if we could just, and Eric, perhaps bring you in here on finance, because when obviously finance is the people who give the money to corporations to invest in these things. And that obviously has undergone a big change. But there's been, I guess, a bit of pushback. So our listeners may be familiar with ESG, the sort of environmental, social governance approach, and the idea that increasingly finance is pouring into sort of positive ESG investments. But I guess there's been a bit of pushback recently, including in fact from Elon Musk. And I just wonder if you could reflect on how powerful ESG is, whether it's working, and whether all of the kind of trillions of pounds in the global economy are really being directed towards the actions you've described, or if there's sort of other things steering it away. What's going on, do you think, with ESG governance?
Well, it's a great question, and as a professional working on these and related subjects in a large financial institution, and I've been thinking about this for many years. I think one of the very important exercises is to stand back and ask yourself, what are we actually trying to achieve with ESG? And this is why, if I put it in the context of the framework of the book describes the problem of net zero as being one of capital investment. Right? So we have to effectively change our energy infrastructure. That's the heart of the transition, right? And that is about capital expenditure. Now, again, if I take the 30 books or so that I've read on climate policy over the last 5 years, the first thing I do with any new book is I go straight to the index and I look up the cost of capital. I think it'll shock you if you do this exercise with all of the books on your bookshelf and see how many books on the environment mention the cost of capital or climate change. It's pretty much close to zero, which is a very revealing omission. Because really what we want to happen in the global system is we want the cost of capital to go up for fossil fuel and carbon emitting activities. And we want the cost of capital to collapse on sustainable activities. And that is the way in which the market system or the capitalist system allocates capital towards sustainable activities. Now, when it's working well, that's what ESG succeeds in doing. When it's working badly, ESG does the opposite. And in the book, we talk about the three hyphens being the risk with ESG, which is mis-selling, which is promising people returns that they're not going to receive. Greenwashing, which is pretending you're doing something when you're not. And then free riding, which is just selling polluting assets to people who are off the radar, so the pollution continues, but then you can claim your newfound green status. And we propose solutions to each one of those problems within the context of the book. But is it working, at a top-down macro level is really the crux of the issue? And I would say it is. If you look at the market capitalization of the oil and gas sector, it has been in steady decline now for about 15 years, which is multiple relevances, which that effectively means the cost of capital has gone up. So if you, to cut a long story short, if you look at a business like Shell, the large oil and gas major, Shell uses a discount rate. So effectively it requires a rate of return of something like 6% if it does offshore wind. It requires a rate of return of about 20% if it does oil and gas. So that is the system working in the right way. And I see that across the stock market and in bond markets. The challenge, I think, for policy is to be acutely aware of the role of the cost of capital. So one of the arguments we make in the book is that policy has been sort of caught on the wrong chapter of the textbook. So there's too much focus on externalities and pricing carbon, when the first chapter of the economics textbook we should be starting with is regulated utilities. This goes back to electricity, the natural monopolies, the national grid. And if you look at the chapter on regulated utilities, it's all about the cost of capital and return on capital. So one of the big proposals that we make in the book is really about de-risking the electricity sector to accelerate capital investment and also to use the state's balance sheet. It's a travesty at the moment. If you look at the UK, we are financing onshore wind or solar with an equity cost of capital. I mean, that's with investors making returns of 6 to 10%. That makes absolutely no sense economically when the state can borrow at 2. So part of what we're saying is use the state's cost of capital at 2 to dramatically bring down the cost of capital. And then in a sense, you can overbuild capacity, which deals with issues like intermittency and other issues within the renewable sector.
That's really helpful. I wonder, there's obviously a huge amount in that we could unpack. But can I just check, because there was something really striking you said about Shell, that was 6% return on a renewable investment. So it would only have to generate 6% return a year, which is pretty manageable, versus 20% for oil and gas. I got that right. And could
that's
you just
right. I think I just need to clarify. I should say, we should probably double check that, because that's from memory from a Bloomberg article I saw about Shell. I'm not a stock analyst. It just comes with those caveats. But it was in that region of numbers was cited in the media.
Just to unpack, why is that? Why is it that Shell needs to?
Yeah, that's ESG working. In my opinion, that's obviously there's Shell is under domestic political pressures. There's been so that's coming from multiple venues. There are activists who've put pressure on Shell in the Netherlands, internationally. It's coming directly from the kind of social stigma associated with the oil and gas industry, but that is also coming from markets. That's coming from shareholders saying, you have to have a net zero strategy. You have to be reducing your carbon footprint, and also just the simple maths of if you look at a company like Ørsted trading at a huge premium to oil and gas companies, so you can see the PE multiple difference.
That's really striking. I wonder if I could just bring in an audience question here from Linda Wallace. Thank you for the question. A reminder, please do post your questions in the comments. We will get to them quickly. But Linda asks, and this, I guess, builds on the point you've just made. So Linda asks, it's lovely to hear such positive comments about electrification and cost. And if that's also, why isn't it happening? What do we need to push for? So given the numbers you just described, why is Shell still doing any oil and gas? I guess is another way of phrasing that question.
Well, let me put a couple of. We've thought about this a lot. We open with a quote from John Maynard Keynes about the Great Depression, and Keynes argued that it was a failure of the mind. And in a way, he was absolutely right. What Keynes was advocating during the Great Depression is pretty much what most developed countries did during COVID, which was he was suggesting that the Treasury and central bank write checks and send them out. And provide financial support through credit creation and government borrowing through the whole economy. So, and in a sense, we view this as a failure of the mind as well. I mean, I go back to the point, and I ask the audience to ask themselves, how many times have they been at discussions about climate policy when people have gone, hang on a minute, onshore wind generators are making an 8% return. The UK government was able to borrow at zero during COVID, right? A fixed rate of interest of zero for a decade, fixed. The point is, this has been absent from the public debate. So part of what we're trying to achieve with the book is completely change the narrative. Everybody continues to talk about what a huge burden climate change is on the population. The losers of what we've described are a tiny percentage of the global population, and those are the owners of fossil fuel assets. Right? So the people to be fearful of the policies that we're describing are not the homeowners, and because we should have lower electricity bills if we had electricity generated by renewables. The people who will lose are the owners of existing gas-fired assets, coal-fired assets, carbon-intensive assets. Right? That is where the value is going to be destroyed if the transition happens. But I think so there's sort of 2 points. First of all, this is happening to some extent. The UK in the next 5 years is going to be a world leader and setting an extraordinary example. Roughly 60% of our existing capacity in electricity is going to be created through offshore wind in the next 5 to 6 years. That is phenomenal. And that hasn't cost us a penny. That has largely been done through contract for differences. And the fact that, as Corinne said, we're pushing on an open door. We have all of these are companies that want to transition as well, so they will provide the capital if we can set up the right regulatory regime.
That's really striking. I hope that I'm taking the answer to Linda's question as being partly it is already happening. We are making this great shift, but partly that kind of failure of the mind and the fact that there is, as you say, a minority of people who are against this and you can see why that's really helpful. And please,
Andrew, can I just make one point, because this is really, really important, and it pertains to the politics and the narrative. The most interesting literature I've seen on the effects of a carbon tax is actually to galvanize populism. Right? So we have to be, we're actually asking for hard-headed economics. The bottom line is renewables are cheaper. Right? So, and as Corinne said right at the outset, our entire strategy is make the green option cheaper, because we have to win hearts and minds. We have to really change this narrative. So people think if net zero was happening rapidly, actually, we would all collectively be better off.
Brilliant. Thank you. That is a lot to chew on. I wonder if we could turn now to that kind of question, that the hearts and minds into, I guess, people. And one of the kind of big things we've talked a bit there about businesses and finance and how they have changed and need to change further. I wonder, Corinne, if I could bring you in on the people side, because one of the big challenges you identify is how people change behaviour. And how do we persuade people to change their behaviour from their current lifestyles to the ones that we need for the climate?
Yeah. Well, I'll talk a bit about our perspectives on it. Aware there will be people who disagree, and I had some interesting debates, which I'll play back from a summit last week. But our perspectives are really drawn from where has this worked? Where have we seen mass behavioral change driving towards kind of a lower carbon lifestyle? And some of the interesting examples that come up led us to this idea of EPICS. EPICS stands for Extreme Positive Incentives for Change. So one of the examples we dive into is Norwegian, not just Norwegian, a number of the Scandinavian countries. There's also a number of Chinese cities have adopted very compelling incentives around electric vehicle purchase. And as of March 2022, sort of 95% of new vehicle purchases in Norway are EVs or hybrids. So working incredibly well in replacing the existing stock of cars with electric vehicles. And effectively, a number of different tax rebates and subsidies and kind of other benefits around parking and tolls makes kind of both purchase and running cost of EVs, 20 to 30% cheaper than petrol vehicles. So it basically and the experience is fairly equivalent. So it becomes a no-brainer for the consumer. So this led us to that kind of quote I mentioned earlier around you've got to make it cheaper, better, or you've got to wait for a social norm to change. And we can try and cultivate social norm change, but that's much harder to control than financial levers and financial mechanisms. And I do just want to mention that I got, last week when I was chatting to a group about this, I got some interesting pushback. From one lady said, have you read the recent Rutger Bregman book on, humankind? And of course, it's a slightly simplistic analysis on, of course, we have a capacity for acting in the greater good. And of course, we have, on many occasions, mobilized that. All we're saying is we haven't yet seen that work in the climate crisis. And yes, we should try to mobilize a mass kind of social movement, and embed in social norms and social status, leading a low carbon lifestyle. But that's not the only bet we can take. We can't rely on that because it's a much more uncertain bet than pulling financial levers and market-based levers to make the green option cheaper and better. So we really are basing on what we've seen to work to date.
That's really
the answer. Sorry, Andrew, can I just
Right.
add to that? If you take the Norwegian example, if you go into a Volkswagen dealership, the list price of the electric vehicle is lower than the fossil fuel intensive vehicle. Now, that's so no surprise you're getting 90% of new vehicle sales are electric vehicles. It really is as simple as that. In fact, the odd thing is why the 10% are continuing to buy an ICE, right? So if we want there's no mystery here. And, we argue in the book this to the sector by sector approach. If you want to have green steel, what we need to do is, what's really important is that we focus on the relative price of the substitute, right? So we're not big fans of just hit everybody with a carbon tax, because you need a substitute. And part of the problem is a lot of the things that we've added carbon taxes to are price inelastic. So they're totally counterproductive. Whereas if you focus on the price of the substitute, you will get a profound effect. So we just want to go, right, steel is a problem. Let's change the tax and subsidy system and corporate taxation, whatever we need to do to make green steel cheaper than carbon intensive steel. Same for cement, same for electric vehicles, same for plant-based burgers. Why isn't it? Why if you go into Burger King, isn't the Impossible Burger 30% cheaper? If you look at America, where I think something like 50% of beef goes into hamburger manufacture, how are you? That's probably the hardest thing to change. Come on, we can't wait for social stigma, for cultural values. They're all going to work against you, if anything, rather than be supportive of transition. Just make it 30% cheaper.
And that there's something really interesting in one of the insights I particularly have held on to from your book, is the point that people are much more swayed by upfront costs than by the ongoing running costs. So if you walk into your car dealership, the cost you pay up front on the day for the electric vehicle has a bigger, we think, impact in people's minds than the running costs ongoing. And that, I guess, is a challenge, because a lot of low carbon items like heat pumps, like electric vehicles, cost less to run. But certainly in the case of heat pumps, which is obviously very close to Nesta's heart, they cost an awful lot more upfront. And I think what you're saying is that's quite a big challenge, and one you have to try and flip around and say, let's make the upfront cost cheaper. Is that?
Yeah, the government has to take responsibility for smoothing that and changing the incentives to. We're kind of saying don't rely on human nature to change in the next 10 years. You've just got to understand what incentives work, and the government has access to the balance sheet to just for heat pumps. Not only it's a real hassle having a heat pump installed. I've not actually done it. I want to do it. My brother's done it. I've got friends who've done it. We want to do it, but it's a big job, and there's disruption and cost. So in order to, you actually need to make it cheaper to counterbalance that hassle. That's our take. It's quite, yes, it would be quite an extreme policy, but the government has the access to low cost of debt to fund it. And if we're going to have a rapid retrofit of UK housing that we need, that's what we think is required to make this happen at pace.
And that I guess is the heart of Epics, is make it easier, cheaper, make it a no-brainer, and affects the decision up front, and tap into that, and you will see change. That's a really powerful thing. I wonder if we could just then turn to carbon taxes as well, because this is one of the things that drew me in. I'm an economist.
Sorry, I do just want to emphasize re-emphasize Eric's point about the narrative. And again, we've had some interesting pushback on this from folks who said this is going to take massive sacrifice, massive national sacrifice, and many folks really believe that. And what we're saying is the economics and the case studies to date that have worked do not suggest that. So this isn't about lying or telling a story to land it. Although, of course, the narrative, we're also saying the narrative is politically important, but we're also just saying that narrative is incorrect.
It's really helpful, and it chimes with actually Nesta with Green Alliance put a paper out yesterday on the links between net zero and productivity, and found that actually a lot of the things we have to do are good for productivity, good for the economy. Exactly what you're saying, in a sense. Repeating the message that you've had out there for a while. So it's a really good story to hear. But that point about this isn't some terrible hardship. Actually, this can be good for your life. These changes can be positive. It's good, but notwithstanding the fact that there are some things like heat pumps which aren't as easy as they could be, and that's one of the reasons why we, amongst others, are working on trying to make them easier and more affordable. Can I turn to the carbon tax thing, because I think this is one of the it's a specific. If you're an economist like me, you've always assumed that the basic narrative is carbon is an externality. It's something that we consume and it imposes costs on others, and so the answer is to tax it. And really striking thing from your book, the first thing that first drew me in was the idea that carbon taxes are okay, but they don't really work that well. And I think you've hinted at this, Eric, but just quickly, what's wrong with carbon taxes, and why aren't they the best answer?
There's a bit of a clue in the history. First of all, it's worth just very briefly being aware of the kind of theory of externalities, is that pricing an externality doesn't mean that it goes away. It's just beneficial from a utility standpoint, right? So if we take the old idea of pollution, like if pollution is harming you and you tax it correctly, it can be that you can then get recompense for the harm. The point here is that we want to collapse emissions. So we don't want to tax them accurately. We want them to go away. So I always say if the carbon tax was successful, it won't raise any revenue because all the emissions will collapse, right? So I don't like these ideas, we'll raise loads of revenue and then start redistributing. What? Because then nobody's behavior is changing. We want a carbon tax that doesn't raise any revenue. The clue here is really, so we try to argue that the two important chapters of the textbook, one we've talked about regulating utilities, the other one is the price elasticity of demand. And if you start with the price elasticity of demand, you go, well, then your policy immediately becomes all about substitutes. Because if you don't have a substitute, something is very price inelastic. If you tax something price inelastic, you don't get much bang for your buck. And in fact, that is the history of carbon taxes. The most successful carbon tax of all time is fuel duty on petrol for cars. And the clue is in the history. I mean, America has actually financed all of maintenance of its federal highways through fuel duty. That only works because it's price inelastic. It's because you don't stop people emitting. If people stopped emitting, you'd have no revenue. If you contrast the Norwegian case, where you've got a huge take-up in electric vehicles, with the UK has one of the highest fuel duties in the developed world, if not the highest, and has very low penetration of electric vehicles. That's because there's no substitute for the fuel. If I've already got a sunk cost and I've invested in a petrol vehicle, you taxing me and I need the petrol vehicle to go to work, it's price inelastic. If I'm going to purchase a car and there's a substitute, then by all means either raise the carbon tax on the petrol vehicle and make the electric vehicle tax exempt, and the relative prices shift, and then you get a huge shift in behavior. So that's really the point that we make, is that if you concentrate on the price elasticity of demand, you move to pricing substitutes, so it totally changes your sequencing. So there's no point in whacking a carbon tax on the cement industry if you're looking at an oligopoly, which frankly won't really change the consumption of cement or its emissions. We just happen to be taxing them a bit more. What makes a lot more sense is let's find a substitute. And then let's use taxes and subsidies to make the substitute cheaper. Now that dramatically changes the consequences. So that simple, subtle shift through saying optimally price and externality, when you shift to no, target the relative price for substitute, has a completely different economic consequence. And we believe all the success stories precisely point to the pricing of substitutes.
Yeah. And just to build on that, because that's again speaks to the economics and where we've seen case studies work. On top of that, there's also this political economy element of the idea that carbon taxes are quite easily hijacked by those who want to tell the story that transitioning to net zero is bad for us, so we use it to their own political ends. It's very easily hijacked. So you don't want, it's kind of political common sense. You don't want taxes to be associated with the green transition, and they don't need to be.
And I sympathize with a lot of the opposition, frankly, because, if you do a proper clear-headed analysis, you say, hang on a minute, I want renewable energy. Renewable energy has much lower marginal costs than fossil fuel energy. So most of the population should be saying, hang on a minute, why haven't we all got cheaper electricity? And yet we have all of these, the political elite or the policymaking class saying that we have to carry the burden of this very high tax. So I actually have some sympathy to people, applying common sense and questioning this. And I think that, by and large, it doesn't stack up.
That's really helpful, and to me, it's a really powerful argument. I hope others listening are persuaded. And it really flips the whole nature of the debate I think we've been having for a long time on its head. You're saying, forget punishing people in taxes, make this about making things easy, rewarding, better. It's a very different conversation to me. I'm going to turn now to some questions from our audience, because we've got a load of really excellent questions from our audience, which is impressively international as well. We've had people joining from Australia, from Cardiff, from Rio. I've seen various different places. But I've got a question here from Dan Ward. It's quite a long question, but I think it's about, in a sense, that point you just made, Eric. So the question is how can we get our political decision makers to accept that a zero carbon, 100% renewable future essentially means energy at zero marginal cost, which in turn means that all the big energy companies simply cease to be. I'll let you read the rest of that, but it's that point about, if this is the future of energy, and it's very different, it's that zero marginal cost, how do you build political consensus, and how do you make, in a sense, build a market, build a system that reflects that, rather than the current system we have?
That's a great question from Dan, and to put it, this is also why we spend so much time talking about the cost of capital. And again, I apologize for this, but what's very interesting, if you think about it, if you build an offshore wind generating capacity, most of the cost is that upfront capital expenditure, because then the fuel, if you will, is free. It's the wind that's provided for free. There obviously are ongoing costs of maintenance and depreciation, so there are some ongoing costs, but most of it is upfront capital expenditure. And this is why we place such a high emphasis on the book in policies that are oriented towards bringing down the cost of capital within those areas of the economy that are going to do this capital expenditure for us. So to the point that Dan specifically has raised, the solution here is effectively to offer electricity investors in our electricity infrastructure long-term price contracts. Now, we are happy to do that as consumers. The government is us. It's the population who pay for our electricity. But if we can do it at a lower price, so if we can put in a price floor, it works for both, because the people doing the capital investment, the Shells, the BPs, the Ørsteds, all these big multinationals who can build these offshore wind generating capacity, if they have some predictability of future electricity prices, that dramatically reduces their cost of capital, and they can actually operate at lower levels of capacity utilization, and we can have way more sustainable electricity generation. To us, on the other side of the equation, we don't mind offering a price floor if it's lower than our current electricity prices, right? I mean, I think this population would be very happy if you said we're going to construct electricity policy so the electricity price declines for the next 20 years. Right? So you can actually square this circle in a way that works for both sides of the equation. But it comes back to, he's hit the nail on the head. The key point here is that actually the technology of renewable electricity is economically superior to one that is reliant on fossil fuels. And this is really obvious today. Why have we got this crazy volatility in electricity prices, where, as a household, as an individual, as a family, if you think, families on low income, if you're a single parent at the moment with children, you've got these, from one year to the next, you don't know what the price of electricity is going to be. That's because it's a global gas price, which is inherently very volatile. So the transition carries with it some huge economic benefits, and it's really important that we communicate those and exploit them.
I read implicit in that question, though, sort of the challenge of, there's an existential challenge to energy companies, and there's quite a lot of political capture. And sort of how do we manage that?
Yeah, that was the bit I was interested in, is if this is such a no-brainer why aren't governments fully behind it and making the changes yet?
Yeah, and of course, I mean, to be honest, we're a lot better off here than some other parts of the world, right? Where the political capture of the energy system and oil and gas systems is much higher. Actually, some of the leading European energy companies are on board and investing and also recognizing this scenario in 40, 50 years time, they'll probably be playing in a different part of the value chain, the energy value chain, in order to survive. But yeah, this question about, I don't have a good answer to the question about lobbying and political capture. It's just continuing to make the case about the fact that the broader public and the consumer will absolutely benefit in this new energy system, and continuing to reiterate that point.
That's helpful. It's a fair point that you've made a very good rational argument, but I guess politics and sometimes people don't always operate in that way. But it's a great question, Dan. Thank you. I'm going to move on, Eric, because we've got a few questions in time. But we'll hopefully come back to this theme of governments and how you build the government support for it. Next question I'll bring up is from Robin Parker, and again, this it's about who should bear the investment costs of net zero. Again, this is a topic I think that you've touched on, but I guess there's an interesting thing that you've talked about governments paying for things with very cheap capital. You've talked about financing and corporations. I wonder if you just help. So as per Robin's question, who should bear the investment costs of net zero? A lot of the times the discussion feels really reductionist, and how much should who pays be based on who gets the benefits?
Yeah. Can I just start with this, and I'm sure Eric will add on, which is this: we need to be analytically clear about, and you say it here, it's investment costs. The vast majority of this is investment. And sorry, this is very patronizing, I'm sure, to the audience, but it's worth reiterating it though. We use the example in the book of putting money into a holiday versus putting money into a house. When you put money into a holiday, it essentially goes down the drain. You're probably sort of mentally and spiritually better off, but you don't have an asset for it. When you put money into a house, you have an asset, financial asset. We are rebuilding vast swathes of the economy. We are creating yielding assets at a higher yield in most cases than the cost to develop them. So the way the question's phrased makes it sound like it's going to be a burden to bear the investment costs. And our thesis is it's not. That we even, it should be an opportunity for developed markets to be using their balance sheet to lend, across the world. And that is a value creation opportunity for that government to then own those value creating assets. So I just want to slightly challenge the premise of the question that it's a negative to bear the investment cost.
And this is something you obviously, it won't always be a positive thing, but this is something you've been saying is stop framing this as we have to charge people and tax people. Start seeing the benefit and invest in it, whether you're the government or a private corporation, because it's just beneficial.
Yeah, it's kind of economic common sense, and there's two nuances and qualifications to that. There's a moment in time. There's kind of, okay, how long is that investment going to take to pay off, and who can finance it up front? That's one nuance. And another nuance is, how do we make sure returns are distributed in a way that is fair to society, particularly when we're decommissioning some parts of the economy and some people might lose their jobs. And that's a much, to my mind, the more complicated part of the policy discussion. But Eric, I'm sure you...
If I could just add as a small point is that if you think of the financial arithmetic of it, so UK government can borrow at 2% for a 10-year period. One of the things we recommend in the book is, why don't we have a green sovereign wealth fund? So let's issue gilts at a fixed rate of 2% for a decade, maybe do 10% of GDP, and then fund investments in renewable electricity. So say you want to provide, why don't we provide the equity? We could provide either the equity or the debt finance. Now, all we need to do is make more than 2%. If we make a return in excess of 2%, we're actually wealthier. Okay, so there's two sides of our balance sheets. We have the liability, but then we have the assets. And the asset generates a higher return than the liability. So we're actually wealthier. This is part of the argument. Now, that is true of all of those investments in renewable energy where you're making capital investment and it's actually a higher return than your cost of capital. But that's really, really important because that's the heavy lifting. Now, there is a cost, which is that effectively we're trying to depreciate the fossil fuel assets. This is the other thing, we're trying to change the way of thinking that this is largely about who owns what parts of the capital structure, the capital investment in our economy. Now, the truth of the matter is, if you buy a petrol-driven car today, what we are trying to do to get to net zero is increase the depreciation. So rather than you use that for 20 years, in a sense, we want you to only use that for 3 years. That's actually, even getting that message out is quite helpful because people really just shouldn't buy petrol vehicles now because of accelerated depreciation, right? Because in a sense, policy is trying to accelerate. So there is a cost to your capital infrastructure, even if you're a household, if your home is carbon intensive and if your mode of transport is carbon intensive. But to the broad economy, most of these are actually return generating opportunities.
Yeah, and the question is the mechanism for redistribution or smoothing, so that yes, if you have a petrol vehicle and can't afford a new vehicle, how do we help the household not bear the hit?
Okay, that's a really helpful answer, and I guess there is your overall frame on this is a lot more positive than most people's, which I think is a really important.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate, we do find it quite frustrating how often you listen to Radio 4 and there's someone interviewing Kwasi Kwarteng or someone, and the question's always, who's going to pay for this? Who's going to pay for this? Like it's a big jolly holiday that's just going to be cashed down the drain. And in the vast majority of cash kind of cost requirements, that's absolutely not the case. We're creating wealth. The challenge is the distribution. That's the challenge.
There's one other, sorry, Andy, there's one other important point on this. I mean, so because again, it depends which sector one's looking at. So if we think of electricity, which is kind of mission critical, there's absolutely no cost. So collectively, we are beneficiaries of that. You can get into academic debates about opportunity cost, but they're really not the point. The point is, given where our cost of capital is, they generate an excess return. The losers are the existing owners of the fossil fuel assets, and we really don't have to worry too much about them. They'll be okay. Right. There's other things like incentives for electric vehicles, incentives to change, the kind of things that you at Nesta have been working on, building and residential housing. Now, I think that the state has to incentivize us to do that, right? If we want that to happen, we have to create huge incentives, and that will have a budgetary consequence. I think, though, to me, the smart way to approach this is say, well, let's find out what the budgetary consequence is. Because the reality is, if you look at the economics of budget deficits and surpluses, they're largely a function of the economic cycle, right? So the UK government now is actually its fiscal position is starting to improve an awful lot. Why? Because nominal GDP is strong, not because of any government policy, right? So the economic cycle is the biggest variable there. But I think the key thing is just to do what's necessary. And then if we need to tighten fiscal policy, which could be due to economic circumstances, we may need to ease fiscal policy. Let's address that separately. In other words, think about optimal taxation, think about distributional consequences independently. Because I think it's an error to actually try and solve for the fiscal position at the same time as you're trying to solve for net zero.
That's really helpful and a call, I guess, to make net zero bigger than sort of year-to-year movements in the economy. It's really powerful. I just want to ask one more question from the audience because there's another good question. This is going back to ESG. So it's a question from Greg Parston, which is that last weekend's FT summarised recent reaction to ESG as woke capitalism, which is, I guess, fits Elon Musk's description. But I think his question is that how can investors drive genuine ESG change when the regulation on ESG is quite limited? So
I would sort of disagree with the absence of. So the UK financial institutions are party to SFDR and a number of different EU requirements on disclosure, and I wouldn't underestimate the power of disclosure. Eric and I have both seen it firsthand many times. When you force a leader or a business leader or an investor to actually look at data that they've never looked at before. Well, you're the bottom quartile in your sector on your emissions, you know, or you've got all these human rights abuses going on in your supply chain. That it's just a natural human reaction for a competitive spirited person to want to improve that, you know, and not want to have that tarnishing their reputation. And so the disclosure requirements are very comprehensive under SFDR, very demanding. There's a huge amount of cost being, in terms of kind of resourcing and personnel, being put into businesses and financial institutions in order to deliver on these disclosure requirements. And, you know, our observation is they're quite powerful for behavior change. Yeah. So I wouldn't say there's no, and proving effective to some degree in influencing the cost of capital. Now, what I would say is probably that the ESG journey, it's going to be chaotic. Because it's what's essentially going on, and in some ways it's amazing it's taken till the 2020s for this to happen, is we are formalizing incorporating non-financial metrics into how we think about business. And it is kind of amazing that we're only doing this now, because it seems so obvious that we should think about the other impacts that the way a business operates has on society. That's what's going on in a nutshell. It's been massively accelerated by the climate crisis and the kind of acuteness of the climate crisis. And it's absolutely a good thing, but it's going to be messy. You're already seeing it being politicized by, you know, the right wing in the US as per this woke capitalism. There's going to be green bubbles. There's going to be people losing money. There's going to be greenwashing scandals, because this is a wholesale transition in how the financial services industry and business industry work. So it's not going to be smooth sailing. You know, and this is a funny little anecdote, but I do often think about it when we were discussing ESG with some lawyer friends who hadn't really come across the term, which is also a reminder about how much it's business and finance jargon. They said, but it makes no sense. It's two nouns and an adjective. Like, they're not even the same type of thing. And it was like such a legal way of coming at it. But it does sum up also that ESG, it's a slightly random grouping. And we're kind of just talking about everything that's non-financial. And as I say, it's progress, but I think we're at the early days. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but that's great.
I'm just conscious of time, and I have one last question, which I think is in your interests, which is from Gab, which is, could you point me to where the publication Supercharge Me, Net Zero Faster can be sourced? That's the book a reminder. Just quickly, given we've had the question, where can people buy it?
You should.
All good bookstores.
Any good independent bookstore should
Amazon.
have it, as well as Amazon, Waterstones. Yeah.
Fab. Sorry, I thought I'd leave with that, given we had the question.
Thank you.
Very kind.
Had to push it, but as I say, it is a really good question. I'm sorry I haven't managed to get through every single comment, and there's so much more we could discuss, Eric and Corinne, but I have found that a very positive and uplifting session. With there's real gnarly detail. There's an awful lot in what you've said in your book, but it is positive. It is action focused. But I'm afraid we will have to wrap up there. I just want to say to the audience, hope you've enjoyed it. There is a short survey which the link will be shared with, in which you can put we really value your feedback on the session. You can say how bad I was and how brilliant Eric and Corinne were. And there is the opposite survey. There is you will be entered into a prize draw for a £50 bookshop voucher. No comment on what you could spend such a voucher on if you win. But that's there. And I should also preview the next Nesta Talks to event, which is with Dr. Yinka Olusoga on the 23rd of June at 12 p.m. A massive thank you, though, finally, before I sign off, to Corinne and Eric. It's been tremendous. I hope people have enjoyed hearing what you have to say, and I hope you've enjoyed speaking to us. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Really appreciate it.